Professor Derek Webb is an assistant professor of law at Catholic University of America, Columbus School of Law, where he writes and teaches in the area of constitutional law, federal courts, civil and criminal procedure, legal history, and American political thought. Professor Webb has had a rich and varied career. Prior to joining the CUA faculty, he was a senior research scholar at Yale Law School, a Dean's Visiting Scholar at Georgetown University Law Center, and a lawyer with Sidley Austin's Supreme Court Appellate Practice Group in Washington, D.C. Before that, he served as a fellow at Stanford's Constitutional Law Center, as a law clerk to Chief Judge Jeff Sutton on the U.S. Court of Appeals for the Sixth Circuit, an attorney advisor to the Rules Committee of the Judicial Conference of the United States, and a Supreme Court Fellow in the Office of the Counselor to the Chief Justice of the Supreme Court. He received his PhD in political theory from the University of Notre Dame and his JD from Georgetown University. Professor Webb is widely published in the area of law and legal history and contributed to building the online interactive constitution of the National Constitution Center. Recently, he was cited repeatedly by Justice Neil Gorsuch in his newest book, Overruled. Professor Webb will be speaking today on a topic drawn from his most recent book project. Please join me in welcoming him.
Thank you, Cecilia. Wonderful introduction. Can people hear me in the back? All right, that sounds good. Great, wonderful. Well, thank you for that very, very nice, generous introduction. It's great to be here. I've actually never been to Madison, Wisconsin. This is my very first time here, so I feel very welcome here. So thank you for the warm welcome. Although I feel like I've been, in some ways, benefiting from the work that's been done here for many years, for well over a decade, particularly by the valiant editors of the documentary history of the ratification of the Constitution. I see a number of volumes in the back of this really nice room. They made possible the very first book I ever worked on, which was a book about this New York anti-federalist named Melancton Smith. And it's indispensable. It's so far been indispensable to the work that I've been doing on this new book on the spirit of amity. So it's a huge honor for me to kind of be here, in Madison, Wisconsin, where the room where sort of it happens, in putting all this history together, to talk a little bit about the Constitution today on Constitution. This is kind of Constitution Week for me. So speaking of the Constitution, when you ask the proverbial sort of man or kind of woman on the street, what does the Constitution mean to you? What is the Constitution? Maybe the first answer you're likely to get is something about rights. Well, it's an enumeration of the very important rights and liberties that individuals have against their government. You can find them in the Bill of Rights, and then you look to the Reconstruction Amendments and the 14th Amendment and see how those rights then got incorporated and applied against the state governments. That's probably answer maybe number one from your man on the street. I think if you push it a little bit, you might get him to say maybe one more thing, that in addition to rights, it's also about structure. It's about how we kind of organize ourselves politically. First and foremost with the federal government that the Constitution creates, with the separation of powers in Articles 1, 2, and 3, and then the relationship between all that and then the state governments that you kind of get in Article 4 of the Constitution. So there, that sort of savvy man on the street might say, check out not just the Bill of Rights, but also the structure of the Constitution. And really, Articles 1 through 7 kind of give you that. And I think that parallels, in a way, the way college professors and law professors teach constitutional law, which is usually breaking constitutional law up into Con Law 1 and Con Law 2. Con Law 1 is structure, Con Law 2 is rights. So in a way, generations of Americans have been introduced to the Constitution through this lens of rights and institutions. And then if you go even a little deeper, law professors, political theorists, historians over the last 50 years have produced just an avalanche, truly an avalanche of material about the original understandings, to the extent that they could understand them, of individual rights and of structure. I would say that's been, over the last 50 years, that's been true with regard to rights. Huge battle of the books about what rights originally sort of understood and what the big animating ideals were and the intellectual influences on the founders were, from basically the 1970s all the way up through to today, certainly in the early 2000s. I would say in the early 2000s, there was a bit of a shift in scholarship and scholarly attention, especially lawyerly attention, not just to rights, but also to constitutional structure. And I think we've seen that particularly with regards to sort of the relationship between the three branches of government provided for in the Constitution and the administrative state. So you see that now not only in scholarship, right, but also in litigation. Lots of attention to both these areas. What I want to do today is suggest that there is a third dimension to constitutionalism, in addition to rights and structure. And that is constitutional culture, or what Alexis de Tocqueville referred to as mores, the habits of mind and habits of heart that citizens kind of need to acquire for the constitutional system to kind of work. And in fact, I want to make an even stronger claim than that. I want to actually suggest that constitutional culture is even more important than individual rights and institutional structure, as undoubtedly important as rights and structure are. The culture is sort of the kind of the undergird, like it undergirds all of that other stuff, that superstructure and that infrastructure of rights and institutions. And a good document to look to think about constitutional culture is this document up on the board here. This is the transmittal letter that George Washington attached to the Constitution when it was sent out on September 17th. He signs this letter and he sends it out to all the states via Congress when they're thinking about ratifying the Constitution. It was published in every newspaper where the Constitution was published. It was cited by the Federalist Papers. It was cited by the Anti-Federalists. It was more important a document at that time in that one-year-long debate than the Federalist Papers were. And that's a big claim. But much more citation and much more interest in what George Washington had to say about the Constitution than what these pseudonymous authors from New York had to say, just in terms of on-the-ground sort of significance. And the thing I want to focus on today is this language that Washington has at the very kind of towards the end of his letter about, and you can't, it's hard to, impossible to see way in the back there, but about what he calls a spirit of amity that he says was indispensable to the creation of the Constitution. And in the talk today and the work I'm trying to do, I'm trying to tease out what Washington and what many Federalists and Anti-Federalists alike thought was this spirit of amity that Washington said was sort of indispensable to the creation of the Constitution. Sadly, I think the transmittal letter has been sort of lost to history a little bit. We don't really spend a lot of time talking about the transmittal letter. I did an informal survey of pocket constitutions from the American Constitution Society to the Federal Society to the National Constitution Center in Philadelphia. None of them begin with the letter that George Washington thought needed to be sort of attached to the Constitution. But he thought it needed to be attached because it put a frame of reference for citizens about how to think about the Constitution. And he uses words, and he uses phrases, and he makes arguments that you're not going to see in the body of the Constitution or in other big state papers, like the Declaration of Independence or the Gettysburg Address or the Articles of Confederation. But they're key, really interesting arguments that I think provide us a bit of a window into the founding that gives us a fresh light on how they were thinking about how to talk with each other about a constitution, how to, despite and across considerable disagreement, find a way to create a constitution and live together amicably. So that's kind of the project. As far as I know, also, no president has ever cited this transmittal letter. No Supreme Court justice has ever cited it. I'm really hopeful that somebody someday will cite this letter and give it some attention, the attention that it's due. But until that blessed day, it's just going to be me talking about the transmittal letter. So let's talk about, there are three concepts that I think are part of the spirit of amity. And they all kind of spring off of different words that you can find in the body of the text of this tiny letter. It's 400 words. You can read it in like 3 minutes. But the first phrase is about the friends of our country. He's addressing this letter to the friends of our country. He uses friends, not a word you're likely to see in other state papers. And I want to begin there, because I think the spirit of amity has the first ingredient is a social ingredient, indispensable social ingredient. And Washington had good reason to think highly of friendship on September 17, 1787, because for the most part, the 55 delegates who had been in Philadelphia, who had deliberated for 4 months, had behaved in the manner of what you might call like civic friendship. They weren't like buddies, they weren't fast friends, but they were working together more or less kind of amicably. And the way they kind of made that happen wasn't just by sort of willing themselves to like really enjoy each other, feeling good thoughts and feelings about each other. Rather, they tried to create a structure for themselves. It's a kind of a social structure, an ethical structure, a parliamentary structure that forced them in a way to kind of talk with each other, even when they didn't really like what they were saying or even like the way people were handling themselves. The first element of that structure is just a really super basic one. They spent a lot of time with each other, a lot of time socially interacting with each other, and not just when they were debating the finer points, of the Commerce Clause. They were spending lots of time together because, first of all, they were boarding together. They were in boarding houses all throughout Philadelphia within just walking distance of Independence Hall. So they were spending a lot of time there. Then they go to Independence Hall every day from about 9 or 9:30 to about 3:30 every day, and they're working out the terms of the Constitution, and they're sitting in tiny little desks, kind of like you guys are, all right next to each other for 5, 6, 7 hours or so every day throughout the week. So they're spending time with each other, they're interacting with each other in that regard. After that day is done, they then go on to dinner. And they have like dinner parties, and dinner clubs start to form throughout the summer. And their point actually is to ensure that people from different parts of the country are having dinner together with each other. And making sure that people who are disagreeing with each other, especially about the big issues of small states and large states and representation, which nearly destroyed the convention, that they're having dinner together. And then, after dinner, they then went into houses around Philadelphia and would have tea with each other, too, and with people, other notables in the Philadelphia area. So they were spending just an enormous amount of time socially together with each other. It's an important point, I think. It was sort of it laid a foundation. On top of that, they had a number of kind of parliamentary rules that they tried to adhere to and observe. They were, for instance, they required that when somebody was speaking, well, first of all, you had to attend every meeting, and when someone was speaking, you were not allowed to talk to your neighbor. You were not allowed to read a book. You're not allowed to read a pamphlet or a newspaper, not allowed to surf the internet. They basically required explicitly, like, you've got to pay attention, even when you don't like what the person is saying. On top of that, they also required, they basically did not take like a roll call of votes. They allowed people to cast provisional votes without kind of setting them down in stone. And they famously kept the proceedings secret. James Madison, reflecting 40 years later in his retirement, said that was indispensable because it allowed people to respond to arguments with an open mind and without feeling that they were sort of committed on an earlier vote. And people did move around and shift votes. This is why George Mason described all of this together, the ethical and the parliamentary and the social, as creating a correspondence of sentiments among each other, where people actually grew to like each other a little bit and work with each other and at least learn from each other. The famous Virginia Plan comes about largely over a dinner party that Benjamin Franklin throws at his house with a special cask of porter, which brought together the delegates from Pennsylvania and Virginia who had never really interacted much before with each other. That serves as the blueprint for the Constitution, but for that cask of porter and that kind of roaring night at Franklin's house, it's unclear whether all that happens. And you see people writing in letters saying, I was a little nervous about these guys from the eastern states, the northern states. But after spending 4 months with them, I am convinced that they have at least as much sort of candor as any people I've sort of known from my home state. So you see them writing about this, and it's kind of working. And that's why in around September 17th of that year, these guys are writing letters to each other, not just sort of propaganda pieces, but to each other saying, this was a miracle. I don't know how this happened, but somehow we got this Constitution, in place. George Washington writes in his own journal that day, like we went to the city tavern, we have adjourned, bells have rung in Philadelphia, and now I retire to my room to consider the monumental thing we just accomplished. So he had lots of reason for hope about civic friendship on September 17th. But it didn't last even 2 weeks. The spirit of amity quickly fell apart. And it's important to note this piece, because it's often lost a bit in the telling of the creation of the Constitution. But just 2 weeks later, in the room right above where the Constitution was created over those 4 months, the Pennsylvania Assembly was meeting to, and they were eager to make sure that Pennsylvania would be the first state, number one, to ratify the Constitution. For among other reasons, they wanted to make sure that Pennsylvania could be the site of the capital, so Philadelphia could be the capital for the new government. So they were pushing. Congress was taking a little long to actually send the thing to the different states, and Pennsylvania's Assembly wanted to kind of jump the gun on Congress, and they held a vote, and they voted on Friday, September 28th, to call a convention, for a state convention to ratify the Constitution, even though it hadn't actually arrived yet. And the Anti-Federalists were like, hold on, let's just take a minute, let's make sure that we actually get it in due form before we sort of do this. And so the Anti-Federalists, the Saturday morning, that was a vote on Friday. On Saturday morning in Pennsylvania, 19 Anti-Federalists decide not to show up to the state assembly for the next day's proceedings, because that next day they're supposed to vote to set a date for when they cast ballots for the delegates. And they needed 46 people for a quorum, and they only had 44 people that Saturday morning, September 29th, 1787. Did they give up? Did the Federalists say, we don't have a quorum? Can't go any further? They did not. They had the sergeant at arms go and track those guys down. And they found one guy, William Findley, an Anti-Federalist from Pennsylvania, who just took off running. They went to a guy named Robert Whitehill's home, banged on his door. A woman comes down. They demand to see Robert Whitehill. She says, give me a moment. She goes upstairs. She's up there for a while. She comes down. I'm sorry, he's not here. But they don't give up, and they go into another home that's well known for being a site for Anti-Federalists, and they break the door down. And they're not asking anymore. And they find two guys, McLean and McCalmont, two Anti-Federalists, and they drag them through Philadelphia to the State Assembly room, above the room where the Constitution had just been created, out of a spirit of amity. And they keep them there, and the guys want to leave. And they cast a vote almost unanimously, not totally, but almost unanimously, saying, no, you cannot leave. They try to leave, and they're barred from leaving. And then suddenly they have a quorum. They got their 46, and they vote, and they set a date for the delegates. But this, of course, outrages Anti-Federalists. This is sort of political violence and precipitancy and haste, and it only gets worse. It only gets worse from there. On September 28th, right around that same time, a guy writing under the pseudonym of Tar and Feathers, writes a letter basically saying, in response to a very, very gentle critique of the Constitution offered by somebody early on, who are you to do this, first of all, but secondly, watch out, because we might treat you the way we treated Tories during the Revolution. And Tories were treated with tar and feathers, which is not fun. That's basically a form of torture and a threat of physical violence. So there was a threat of physical violence against critics of the Constitution. Then the printers, the Federalist printers in Philly, in Boston, in New Haven, in Georgia, mostly run by Federalists, they refused to publish criticisms of the Constitution unless the critic of the Constitution left their name with the printer, or published their name. Because at that time, there was a tradition of writing under kind of pseudonyms, dates back to at least the Revolution. But they would not allow critics to write with pseudonyms. They required their names, or at least to leave their names with the publisher. And they gave as their reason, well, you never know, these Anti-Federalists, these criticisms might be, as I said, dipped in foreign ink. These might be foreign nationals, enemies of ours who want to divide and conquer us. And so we just, for that purpose, we need to make sure that their names are available. It seemed to most that really the reason was to intimidate, and scare away critics of the Constitution from even daring to raise objections. The Federalists didn't really want to make a lot of arguments with these Anti-Federalists, these budding Anti-Federalists. But when they did, when they kind of deigned to reason with them at all, their main go-to move was what the Anti-Federalists called invoking the magic of names. The magic of names. In other words, look at who just signed the Constitution. George Washington. George Washington, who just beat the English, a decade ago and secured our independence. Benjamin Franklin, the most famous man in the world, who is beloved in Paris, you, Richard Henry Lee, are going to like object to who knows Richard Henry Lee outside of Virginia. Everybody knows these guys, the authors of the Constitution. Nobody knows you, and nor really should they. You don't really have the equipment to sort of understand the Constitution. And so they don't reason with them. They make an argument basically from authority and also sort of more or less from intimidation. Again, frustrating to the Federalists, the Anti-Federalists. And then at the Pennsylvania Ratifying Convention, a couple of months later, the Federalists refuse. They vote overwhelmingly. They have the votes, a lot more Federalists than Anti-Federalists in Pennsylvania. They have the votes, and they don't allow the critics to publish their disagreements or dissenting reasons, their concerns about the Constitution in the official journal. They thought it was a waste of time and a waste of money. And so they don't allow that to happen either. And the Federalists win. They win. They had the votes, and they ratify the Constitution in the state of Pennsylvania. However, just a couple weeks later, after they ratify, December 26th, right, the day after Christmas, there is a party in Carlisle, Pennsylvania, kind of the middle part of the state, and they're throwing a party in celebration of the ratification of the Constitution. And a bunch of Anti-Federalists come, and they are not thrilled with this party, and they go and they attack these Federalists, and they almost bludgeon one guy to death. 7 of them are arrested, put in jail in Carlisle. A couple weeks later, a militia of about 1,500 Anti-Federalist critics descend on Carlisle, and Pennsylvania is at the brink of civil war. And they demand the release of these 7 Anti-Federalists, who are then actually just released. It does work. And then over the next 4 months, the Anti-Federalists get a petition going that gets 5,000 signatures saying the ratification in Pennsylvania had been illegitimate and we need a redo. So they won, but they did not win the hearts of the critics of the Constitution. And something else was needed. And that something else is the second word that I want to focus on, which happens a couple times in this text, the word consideration. So moving from kind of a social, the social fabric and social infrastructure that allowed for the creation of the Constitution to go forward, they needed one additional ingredient, which was how to think about a Constitution, not just in a small room with about 55 lawyers, but out in the big public domain with 3 million people at that point, all across the eastern seaboard. And so Washington says a couple times we need to kind of think about the word consideration. This is submitted to you for your consideration. And consideration was really not going very well at that time. There were lots and lots of sort of terrible things people were saying about each other at that time. Louis Guillaume Otto is a French diplomat, writing in November, said the two parties abuse each other in the public papers with a rancor which sometimes does not even spare insults and personal invectives. And then I sort of counted up all the invectives. I was curious, so I kind of read through the documentary history and I looked for invectives, and there were a lot of them, and just a handful, just for your edification. So the supporters of the Constitution, they call the Anti-Federalists the anti-federal junto, malignant, ignorant, and short-sighted triflers, modern Tories, Satan-like, Judas-like, unchristian, lying prophets. This is my favorite, filthy puppies, the enemies of America, and I like this one too, the witches in Macbeth, dancing around the cauldron of sedition, each throwing in his proportion of spells for the confusion of his country. So there was somebody wrote a little dialogue called a political dialogue, called himself Mr. Grumble. He was an anti-federalist. He complained that, every man I have conversed with has been ready to knock my brains out if I said a word against the Constitution. The Anti-Federalists did not, of course, take this lying down. Predictably, they returned fire with fire. And they were pretty good, too. Some of their language was they called the Federalists well-born masters, a violent and tyrannous minority, haughty lordlings of the convention, self-important nabobs, harpies of power, parasites and tools of power, and monarchy men, militiamen, aristocrats, and drones, whose noise, impudence, and zeal exceeds all belief. I could go on, but it gets kind of nasty after there. But But Franklin is observing all this. Franklin, who had sort of been very active in the Philadelphia Convention, has now his health has deteriorated, and he's back at home, but he's reading all these papers, and he's just, he's watching this happen kind of in real time. And he has this really, pithy observation about Philadelphia that, if I can share with you, just it's an underappreciated sort of comment by Franklin. And I'm from Philadelphia, so this strikes home. The inconsistency that strikes me most, this is Franklin, is that between the name of your city, Philadelphia, brotherly love, and the spirit of rancor, malice, and hatred that breathes in its newspapers. For I learned from those papers that your state is divided into parties, that each party ascribes all the public operations of the other to vicious motives, that they do not even suspect one another of the smallest degree of honesty, that the anti-federalists are such merely from the fear of losing power, places, or emoluments, which they have in possession or in expectation, and that the Federalists are a set of conspirators who aim at establishing a tyranny over the persons and property of their countrymen and to live in splendor on the plunder of people. And so he says later, Pennsylvania looks like to the world, it's peopled by a set of the most unprincipled, wicked, rascally, and quarrelsome scoundrels upon the face of the globe. But he sees a silver lining in all this somehow. He says, this is classic Franklin, I think. There is, however, one of your inconsistencies that consoles me a little, which is that though living you give one another the characters of devils, dead you are all angels. It is delightful when any of you die to read what good husbands, good fathers, good friends, good citizens, and good Christians you were, concluding with a scrap of poetry that places you with certainty, everyone in heaven. So that I think Pennsylvania a good country to die in, though a very bad one to live in. That's great, Franklin. And right, so no golden age. This was not a moment of, of amity throughout the deliberations. It's also important to emphasize that the Federalists, they're starting to write now. Hamilton, Madison, and Jay, they're getting going, and they're starting to write. And George Washington is nudging them to do this. Washington, the great strategist. And he sees this problem, and he urges the Federalists, you've got to, talk with the anti-federalists. You've got to sort of meet them on the plane of reason and not just on sort of with invective and ad hominem attack. And so the Federalists, the first thing they notice, actually, is that all this rancor, all this malignancy, all this tumult, been there, done that. It's going to be, if you look at history, ancient confederacies and modern confederacies, they are all marked by this level of tumult and disagreement. And it's sown, as he said, in the nature of man to disagree. We are quibblers. We don't like to agree with each other. And they say, if you can't find something really significant to disagree about, you'll find something trivial to disagree about and form, red teams and blue teams. But he says, they say when the stakes get higher, our level of discourse goes lower, too. So we'll debate about trivial things, and then when we're talking about more important things, we get even worse. And then when we're in groups, we're even worse. They say, a nation of philosophers is not to be expected. But even if we had a nation of philosophers, a nation of Socrates, they would still be basically, effectively, a mob. So they have a pretty, somewhat dim view of, public discourse and public deliberation. They're not inclined to think that it's going to always go super well. So they were not naive in that regard. However, I think it's an important point. They thought some healthy level of discourse was necessary for the country. So it's very hard, but it's also necessary to try to work for it. And they give three really interesting reasons why public discourse is important to maintain on a relatively high level. The first is existential national security. If we are divided so deeply amongst ourselves, we are going to be easy prey for France, England, and Spain. So that's very much actually on the mind of John Jay, the older man of the Federalists at that time. He's keeping an eye on that point. Number two, they're concerned about the possibility of demagogues. And Madison goes through this kind of litany of all these moments in ancient history where democracies handed over power to demagogic figures or kings or emperors, mainly because they simply could not get along themselves. And the level of discord got so high, they're like, I'd rather like the devil that we know there than this sort of cacophony of disagreement. And the third and final reason they were concerned about this was because it gives great ammunition to critics of democracy. So much division and so much disagreement and so much animosity. These are the things that the critics of democracy love, and they point to as, look, Exhibit A, you guys can't make this happen. So the Federalists knew that it was going to be tough, but they also thought it was important to try to make it work. To me, the thing that has been most delightful as I've been kind of reading through these papers has been looking at actually what the anti-Federalists were doing at this point. Because I think the critics of the Constitution often get short shrift in our consideration of the creation of the Constitution, but during this period, this critical period from like September through like January or February of 1788, they are reasoning on the fly, pretty much for the first time in American history, about how to create a public sphere. What the terms of a public debate look like, not with 55 delegates in the room in Philadelphia with tea parties, but with 3 million people with a lot of diverse opinion and diverse backgrounds. And so they're thinking about this in pretty deep ways and then connecting it up with the principles of the American Revolution. And their number one starting point, and they say it again and again and again, is citizens of the country have to think for themselves. That's like number one. You can't just sort of hand your mind over to George Washington or Benjamin Franklin. And the reason they say that is because, well, look at our political principles. We're committed to equality. We're committed to liberty. Well, if we believe in political equality, we should also have at least enough confidence in ourselves to give it a shot to reason through, the ups and downs of the Constitution, the pros and cons of the Constitution. And in fact, they kind of go a little harder and say, like, if you consider yourselves like Republican citizens, and they they would add to, like, are you like men of the American Revolution? If if you are, you need to kind of think for yourselves. I think it's applicable to everybody, but this was the principle that they were kind of invoking, a certain kind of like dignity. Like, you, farmer, yeoman, have a good brain, and oftentimes the great, so-called great, often err. In sometimes disastrous ways. So it's super important for everybody to kind of think for themselves. You see that everywhere in the Anti-Federalists, and I had not really seen it before until kind of going through all this. It was not only a right, though, but it was also a duty. He thought citizens had a duty to think for themselves on their own. And then they had, they kind of tick off a lot of ideas in which, like, how to think for yourself. How do you actually do this in the first place? And the first piece, the first ingredient of thinking for yourself was time. The Federalists wanted to kind of like race things through, and the Anti-Federalists said, we need at least some time. We need time in order to study the Constitution, in order to read it. And you have Anti-Federalists at some point saying, I've now read this thing like so many times, I'm just sick of the thing. But you could see that they were conscientious about it, and they were taking that injunction to kind of read the thing seriously. As Sentinel put it, consideration ought to precede approbation. In addition, facts and a thorough review were kind of the essential part of that consideration. Again and again, they were emphasizing the importance of how, like Maryland Farmer, for instance, says the object of public inquiry is to be, or ought to be, truth. And that truth is grounded in facts and kind of evidence. That was the currency of debate: evidence, facts, and argument. Federal Farmer observed, it is too often the case in political concerns that men state facts not as they are, but as they wish them to be. But the Anti-Federalists were trying to get them on the ground of kind of terra firma facts. They also added an important point, especially for them. When you're in a big public debate with others, you have to hear both sides. And they say that again and again as well. So an Anti-Federalist named Caution observed, you ought to hear both sides, with the emphasis on both. As the man who determines on hearing one party only will almost always be mistaken in his judgment. He may be in the right, but it will be by chance and not by reason. Hearing both sides was sort of indispensable to kind of the reasoning process. And then, over and again, they're focusing on, they want the debate, the public discourse, to focus on arguments and not on names and not on ad hominem attacks. And there's an avalanche of ad hominem attacks at the time, but they are kind of very strong on this point that, as John DeWitt, one of the Anti-Federalists, observed, America has nothing to do with passion or hard words. Every citizen has an undoubted right to examine for himself. Neither ought he be be ill-treated and abused because he does not think at the same moment exactly as we do. Another little piece, another ingredient is moderation or calmness. Just a certain tenor of discourse is needed also for public debate. When important subjects demand discussion, they ought to be treated with coolness and moderation. Reason should be alone appealed to and meet no interruption for prejudice or passion. All of this is building up to an idea that they're trying to create like a nationwide conversation, really for the first time ever. And the essential sort of what they call the aorta of America for this purpose is the national press, a free press. The free press is the vehicle by which information is going to spread throughout the country. And lots of Federalists are locking up the printing presses and preventing anti-Federalists from publishing their papers. So they become huge fans and defenders of a free press and an idea of a public discourse happening through the distribution of newspapers. And a generation before John Stuart Mill invokes kind of his confidence in public reason. The anti-Federalists are right there, and they're saying, if you get all this right, if you try to set those terms as we just kind of laid out, the truth will eventually out. Not maybe right away, but they have this metaphor of public debate as a furnace, that you put things into it and you let things burn up. And if there's gold in these arguments, they're going to hang in there. But if it's made of something less significant, it will vanish. So they're building what I think Jonathan Rauch has called a constitution of knowledge. The way in which you kind of vet information in the public square in the context of a contentious political debate. And their final point on all this is the legitimacy of this entire Constitution hinges on getting all that right. If we don't get the mode of discourse right, the hearts of the people who objected to the Constitution will never be won over. And you're going to get more Carlisle riots if you don't get the terms of debate right. All this is sort of coming, really for the first time in American history, where they're kind of laying this out about the connection between the legitimacy of the Constitution and public discourse. Bless you. The Federalists respond, and I recommend the next time you pick up a copy of the Federalist Papers, take a look. It was actually envisioned to be 2 books. Book 1 was Federalist 1 through Federalist 36, and then Book 2 was 37 through 85. And at the beginning of the first book, Federalist 1, Hamilton says, we need to learn a lesson of moderation. That sometimes, and the lesson of moderation there was those who disagree with us about politics, even on important matters, are not necessarily evil as a result of their kind of political disagreement. And people who agree with us may not have arrived at those positions through kind of honor and integrity. In other words, you can disagree with other people without kind of hating them. That was lesson 1 in the Federalist Papers. In Federalist 37, Madison doubles down on that and expands on that. He talks about a spirit of moderation, that national discourse needs to try to be conducted in the spirit of moderation. And when we hear the word moderation, I think we often think of sort of moderate, like up the middle, splitting the difference kind of thing. That was really not their view of what the spirit of moderation meant. I think what they meant, and they said it again and again in response to the Anti-Federalists, is that to engage in a discussion with the spirit of moderation meant being independent of party zeal, or not having a predetermined view of any particular question. And so they say that these Federalist Papers were not addressed to either the predetermined foes of the Constitution nor the predetermined supporters of the Constitution. We're addressing this to people with open minds. And that leads to the big argument that the Federalists make about how they're going to respond now to the Anti-Federalists at the bidding of George Washington, basically. And the way they frame it is they're going to make an argument open to all. They say that in Federalist 1, and they carry that out throughout most of the Federalist Papers, an argument open to all. And what that meant was that anybody could pick up their arguments and engage with them. And they didn't have to buy their first principles. In fact, the Federalists would try to do their best to argue with their interlocutors, not on their own first principles, but on the first principles of their interlocutors. Start with where the interlocutors were, and then suggest that, in fact, actually what you think there actually points more in the direction of the Constitution. You'll be surprised if you pick up the Federalist Papers how many state surveys Madison is doing. Many of you are future lawyers. You might have the opportunity to someday work on a 50-state survey in law firm somewhere. Well, Madison and Hamilton were doing the same thing. They were using what they call the best oracle of information, which was evidence, experience, not just kind of theory, to kind of point out the flaws of the Anti-Federalists. And that was kind of the heartland of sort of the way that they kind of made their arguments against the Anti-Federalists. Not with kind of like arguments from authority, but arguments based on the very same authorities that the Anti-Federalists were relying upon. All that was wonderful, and all that led to a profusion of amazing essays for and against the Constitution. The ratification contest led to very deep lows, as I've tried to sort of indicate, but also pretty high highs, too. The debates, the arguments that the Federalists and the Anti-Federalists generated sort of live with us today. And the criticisms of the Constitution that the Anti-Federalists made, some of them today, echo today as sort of very prescient. Same also with the Federalists, which we continue to invoke today. The arguments got better. The quality of the arguments got better as the debate went along. But that wasn't enough to secure ratification. And this leads to the third and final point, the third element of the spirit of amity that I think George Washington was referring to. And this comes at the very end of his, this big paragraph here. Thus, the Constitution which we now present is the result of a spirit of amity, and here's the phrase, and of that mutual deference and concession which the peculiarity of our political situation rendered indispensable. Consideration and argument were not enough. Something else was. So they had an Enlightenment confidence in reason. You can see that, especially with the Anti-Federalists. They believed in the power of reason to sort out truth from fact, from fiction, and through the sifting process, get at truth in political discourse. They believed in the capacity of the mind to kind of figure stuff out. But they were also somewhat skeptical of that ability, too. They also had their moments of sort of self-doubt. And they encouraged people to enter into public discourse with an element of self-doubt. I don't think there's a more beautiful illustration of this than Benjamin Franklin on the last day of the convention, where he urged his fellow delegates, especially the ones who were kind of holding out on the Constitution, to, as he put it, doubt a little of their own infallibility. And he says, everybody more or less, especially in politics and in religion, thinks that they are infallible. And he says that there are some people who, basically say the only person I know who's right all the time, is me. It's funny how that works. But everybody feels that way, or a lot of people feel that way, especially when you get into politics. And so the challenge was to get these very proud, people who knew that they were always right and everybody else was always wrong, to just doubt a little bit of that in order to broker something of a compromise. And so at the Philly Convention, the big names who we call the Albert Einsteins of the Constitution, like the James Madisons and the James Wilsons, the people you guys may study, in con law or in political science classes, they are not the indispensable figures, actually, at the Constitutional Convention. It's other names like William Samuel Johnson. When is William Samuel Johnson Day in American history? But he was indispensable to the Connecticut Compromise, which keeps the Constitution together. They formed these little committees in Philadelphia full of mostly sort of backbenchers and moderates who were not the bright lights and the big names, but they were more willing to kind of meet the other side halfway than people like Madison and Wilson, who objected to a number of the key compromises of the Constitution. That continues on through the debates about the ratification. But the Federalist Papers invoke these themes too, about compromise and concession and deference. The Federalists were trying to get Americans to, as they put it, put on their considering caps. I love that phrase, put on your considering cap. And they wanted people to think and make it arguments open to all, right, as they tried to argue. But they didn't think that that was, totally enough. They thought that, or there was a way of thinking that could be kind of counterproductive. They wanted people to think, but there are a few words that they use in the Federalist Papers that they almost always use with disdain. And those words are theory, or abstract, or perfect. Whenever you see those words in the Federalist Papers, they're usually saying those are not things we love. Because no constitution, no creation of humans, all invariably imperfect and fallible, is going to be a perfect arrangement. It's always going to be imperfect. They recognize the imperfections. And in fact, Madison has a line quoting this transmittal letter. He says, it is superfluous to try. He's talking about the Anti-Federalists criticizing elements of the Constitution. It is superfluous to try by the standard of theory a part of the Constitution which is allowed on all hands to be the result not of theory, but of a spirit of amity and that mutual deference and concession which the peculiarity of our political situation rendered indispensable. Madison is quoting Washington here to kind of ward off against a kind of a perfectionism in sort of politics or constitutional thinking, and to, in a way, lower the bar for them as they're trying to ratify this Constitution. The big conventions that happen in 1788 are in Massachusetts, in Virginia, and New York. Those are much, much bigger conventions, and they are divided. In Philly, in Pennsylvania, it was so lopsided, the Federalists could just kind of roll over the Anti-Federalists. But in all those states, in Massachusetts, Virginia, and New York, the Anti-Federalists not only had substantial numbers, they actually had more people, actually, than the Federalists in each of those three conventions. So if they had just kind of voted party line, the Anti-Federalists could have shut the Constitution down. And they had good reason to think they might. There was a lot of frustration, especially with the way the Federalists had conducted themselves in Pennsylvania for the first 4 months of the debate. Again, this is where George Washington comes in, and he urges his fellow Federalists, you need to kind of treat your kind of critics of the Constitution in these other conventions with candor, with generosity, with kindness, with grace, with kind of grace notes. And these three conventions operate very, very differently. They debate the Constitution clause by clause. They allow very prominent Anti-Federalists to speak as long as they want to speak. One Anti-Federalist comes away from the convention in Massachusetts thinking, I've never been treated more politely in my life than here in Boston. So they do have they're approaching things differently. And in each state began with more Anti-Federalists than Federalists, but barely squeaked through a victory in each of those states. In Virginia, it began 144 to 192 against. By the end of the convention, after they debated the clauses, particularly because of the current governor at that time, Edmund Randolph, who had been an opponent of the Constitution, but voted for the Constitution. You see people moving from one side to the other. The Constitution is ratified in Massachusetts by the thinnest of it's about 187 to 168 votes. 19 votes out of about 355 determine the outcome of that. In Virginia, the same dynamic happens. Excuse me, I said Edmund Randolph, but I meant to say Sam Adams. Excuse me, Sam Adams in Massachusetts, the beer guy. Sam Adams and John Hancock are critical in Massachusetts. In Virginia, it's Edmund Randolph, who helps to secure the ratification 89 to 79. And Edmund Randolph had opposed the Constitution in Philadelphia, but he voted for the Constitution in Virginia. And then finally in New York, my guy, the guy I've written about, Melancton Smith, a critic of the Constitution, likely the author of Federal Farmer and Brutus, spent a whole year debating James Madison and Alexander Hamilton about the Constitution, particularly about the Supreme Court. He goes over to the federal side and brings 12 of his colleagues with him, ruins his political career. He's persona non grata in the state of New York ever since. But New York ratifies 30 to 27 because of Melancton Smith. It's these guys, Melancton Smith, Samuel Adams, Edmund Randolph, who are, in a way, the earliest kind of American profiles in courage, who do what the Federalists urged them to do, which is to sort of operate with a spirit of moderation and not be sort of so wedded to kind of partisan loyalty. And I think their stories need to be told a little bit more to kind of understand the mindset that went into kind of creating the Constitution. And that gets me to the fourth and final point, the conclusion of my talk today. Thank you for your attention so far. The word indispensable, he writes it a little funny, but indispensable, that's the word that he uses for the spirit of amity. And you can see just practically, like, it was indispensable. If you don't have those ingredients, you don't get the Constitution created in Philadelphia and ratified throughout the country. And so I think the transmittal letter kind of provides a window into this founding period, a way of thinking about how they thought about talking with each other in a big context. I think when we think about the founders, especially on like big, patriotic days like Constitution Day, we think of their views of rights and their views of institutions. I don't think we think as much about the dynamic by which they actually kind of created the Constitution. They cared not only about the ends of government, what it was supposed to accomplish, or the institutional means by which they were kind of trying to secure the Constitution, but what you could call the mode of constitutional governance. And they were just as attentive to that as they were to the ends and the means. And in fact, they derived that mode from the ends. You can see that especially with the Anti-Federalists, the ends of liberty and equality that they fought so hard for in the American Revolution. They're taking those ends and they're deriving from them a view of how to conduct ourselves in the public square. Not only is it derived from those ends, but it's indispensable to the legitimacy of the means. It's indispensable to the legitimacy of the new institution of the federal government that you're creating in the Constitution. So it was sort of central to both things. But the transmittal letter, I think, this is my kind of final point. The transmittal letter not only is a window into the founding period and into this moment, which I think is fresh and interesting, colorful and funny, frankly. It also is a bit of a window, or sort of a mirror for us that we can kind of hold up to ourselves in our own sort of moment to reflect a little bit of how we're doing on the spirit of amity, on that, as Washington put it, right? And I think, it's safe to say that I think we are in a bit of a pinch with regard to this issue, particularly with these three kind of interlocking, what you might call epidemics almost, that hit the social, the intellectual, and the political dimensions of what I've talked about here. With regard to the social issue, the Surgeon General of the United States, just I think about a year ago, recently came out with a report on loneliness among Americans, and saying that Americans of all ages are reporting greater levels of loneliness than prior generations had. And in fact, younger people are reporting much higher levels of loneliness than people somewhat older than them. We're having a hard time just spending time with each other, and befriending each other, and getting to know each other outside the context of furious political debate and discussion. Which is one point. Epidemic number two is what Jonathan Rauch, I think I already referred to him as an epistemic crisis. Having a harder time sorting out truth from falsehood in public discourse, and not really maintaining a lot of confidence anyway in the institutions by which we sift truth from falsehood, whether it's in the university context or whether it's in the political context. And I'd say fewer participants in our public life seem to take the time, really, maybe to study these serious questions and try to make arguments. And I think, of course, the profusion of incivility or ad hominem attacks, I think, also cuts against the norms that they were trying to articulate during this critical period. And then on the political side, our politics have obviously become sharply divided. We're sort of siloed in many cases, intellectually and politically. Compromise, which was a word of kind of, a positive word during the creation of the Constitution, is often treated as kind of betraying one's higher principles. And moderate figures like Melancton Smith or Edmund Randolph or William Samuel Johnson seem to be sort of exhausted or sort of cowering. I think they are still out there, but I'm not so sure that they feel emboldened enough to sort of enter the public square. There should not now, however, be a council of despair. I do think that we have some struggles on these fronts, which is why I want to kind of frame this conversation in these terms. But the founders themselves struggled with all three of these things as well. It is human nature to struggle with all three of these things. But my hope is that kind of by taking seriously the Constitution's cover letter, kind of putting it back where Washington thought it needed to be, sort of at the front of our thinking and the forefront of our thinking about the Constitution, we can see at least why these interlocking cultural epidemics are not only a threat to individual well-being, but also potentially a threat to our kind of constitutional survival as well. Civic friendship, rigorous fact-based debate, and intellectual doubt are at the center of our national experiment. And so to help revive those norms, it may help to recall just how central they were to the deed of creating the Constitution. There is more to the Constitution than rights and structure. Every 50 or 75 years or so, some figure comes along, like a George Washington or Alexis de Tocqueville, a learned hand, or Sandra Day O'Connor, who kind of points us back in these directions of constitutional culture and their kind of fundamental nature. And I think it would be good for that period to happen not every 50 or 75 years, but on a more regular basis. So I think, if we are lacking the spirit of amity or mores or the spirit of liberty at scale and with enough buy-in among citizens, leaders to make a difference, we may face a bit of a constitutional crisis, and not just a personal one. Because to quote George Washington at the very end, the peculiarity of our political situation renders the spirit of amity as indispensable today as I think it was in 1787. So thank you for your attention. Happy to chat.
Thank you so much. If you need to leave to attend a class or to go to another appointment, we understand, certainly. Otherwise, Professor Webb is kind of free. And we do have ceiling mics, that, so I don't think we actually need to hear one around. If you want to raise your hand if you have a question, happy to keep it here. All right.
There was one. I can ask it.
I think one question.
Oh, I just had a quick question about the idea of this is obviously a very, very idealistic process, and so I was just kind of curious about the practicality versus the idealistic. So obviously within our world, there's a lot of discourse that's pretty polarizing, and then there's also differences of people's access to information and access to understanding of that information. So I was just curious about the practicality of implementing the idealism.
Yeah, and maybe so speaking as a historian, maybe first, just somebody who kind of works with these materials. On the practicality side, I think one thing that comes to mind right away is early on this information, access to information. That became a point of great controversy during the early debates because the critics of the Constitution wanted more copies of the Constitution published and in English and in German to be sent out to the other parts of the state. So they were asking for basically 3,000 copies to be printed. And the Federalists kind of pushed back fairly hard on that and thought it would be sort of a waste of money to do that. Eventually, I think they technically agreed, but then there were reports that the papers never actually reached people outside in the states. So right away they were battling maybe the issue that you're concerned about, which is sort of access to information and how people can obtain information. And at that point, obviously, the technology was quite different at that point. But the same concern undergirded the critics of the Constitution. More information is better was their sort of hunch. And early on, the Federalists were not so sure that was true. I think, though, my point was that towards the end of the debate, they did converge on this point, that on both sides, that more information was better. The Federalists agreed to publish the criticisms of the Constitution in the Massachusetts and Virginia and kind of New York journals, and they allow them to debate as long as they want to, too. So they're allowing for more, at least the spread of information within the convention itself. And in Massachusetts, as I recall, they have the largest number of newspaper editors or reporters allowed. I think they had 51 people who were kind of packed into this huge room. By that standard, by those times, a pretty large number to kind of produce content for newspapers in different states. And so that's just one point on response to the access issue. On the response to idealism, I mean, for sure there is idealism here. I would say that Washington's spirit of amity is kind of what Lincoln referred to as the standard maxim to be reached for, but never necessarily sort of be attained. It's not. This is as I try to illustrate quickly, they were underperforming on this score as well. But that doesn't take away from the fact that they did think that it was an important ideal and something to hold out for and try to work to correct if possible. And I do think you see at least moments of self-correction during this debate. I mean, you see the Carlisle riot, and you see the disaster there, and at least some people are saying we've got to shift gears, we have to change, and that's coming happily from the top at that point, from George Washington. So I totally concede the point that there is an element of idealism. I'm hopeful that I don't drift too far into naivete, but at least noting just that they were struggling with these same issues, but they still held it out as an ideal, and they thought it was a constitutional ideal too. Thanks for the question.
No, thank you.
In undergrad, one of my professors had talked about how, to some degree, a lot of the informal ways that delegates or lawyers or whoever, how they used to improve camaraderie, get to know each other better, have kind of been formalized out. So I believe it was during the Carter administration, they had like the presidential yacht, and they would take different people from the legislature out there, specifically people who were disagreeing, and then hope, after a weekend on a boat, they were more friendly towards each other.
Mm-hmm.
And so, do you think to some degree that in pursuit of formal affairs, we've lost a lot of the camaraderie, like ways to generate it, or is there something else that's happened there?
Yeah, no, right. Thank you for the question. And I think it's a super important one. I do think that the social ingredient is sort of an essential one. It was essential for at least the creation of the Constitution initially in Philadelphia. And I think there is a concern today, among people when they look at our national elected officials, that they rarely spend much time socially with each other. They may see each other, in the halls of Congress, but they're there for just a few days, and they're mostly sort of hanging, with their own staffers and their maybe their constituents too. But the art of spending time socially with others, with whom you disagree but have to get along, I don't really see a lot of attention paid to that, and I think there is an artistry actually to that, and I think it can make a difference. It made a difference in this particular moment, and I've certainly seen that in the lives of my own friends and others, where you may not come to agreement with the person you are spending time with, but you might think differently about that person. In other words, like that Hamilton idea about lesson of moderation, that you might come to this conclusion that, yes, I still disagree with you. You're still kind of wrong. However, I don't think you're evil, sort of, for holding the position that you do. And we're now in a position where we're more likely to sort of think not only is the person wrong, but they're also evil for holding the position that they do. And I do think spending time with those people and their families can kind of affect that, and it does affect that. And I do think, for instance, in the Supreme Court, that is something that undergirds all the lunches, for instance, that they have with each other. It's a nice tradition, and I think it's in that very spirit. And I think we could use a lot more of it.
Thank you for coming. The Spirit of Amity, I don't know if you're familiar with an organization called Braver Angels.
Yeah.
Jonathan Rash is a friend of Braver Angels.
Yeah.
For folks who don't know, I think a Spirit of Amity is the catchphrase of Braver Angels. A lot of it is bringing together reds and blues, having conversations, finding common ground, not identifying people as their ideas, but identifying them with humans first. So I think it goes to how realistic is this? There are organizations that are working to do that.
Mm-hmm.
But I really appreciate your point about this being an ideal, and the point about Lincoln, maybe one we never reach, but one we should always strive for. I'd be curious, in your work, perhaps outside of, this is huge, but day to day, what opportunities do you see for people to work on the Spirit of Amity?
I do like Braver Angels, and I think there are other groups like that. I think there's the National Institute for Civil Discourse, run out of Arizona State, I believe, that I think Sandra Day O'Connor and her kind of family has helped sort of nurture along. Thinking about Sandra Day O'Connor, frankly, I mentioned her in my remarks. She did institute this tradition of having lunches with Supreme Court justices, but she had actually done that when she was a state legislator in Arizona. She was, I think, the majority leader in the Senate in Arizona, and her kind of insight was, why don't we just have like chalupa parties and throw beer at our serve beer at like our house for the Republicans and Democrats in the state legislature. And according to like people on the ground at the time, they like never really had a sharp word for each other while she was sort of serving in that role. So those sorts of things can go a long way. And so in a way, like, it's conversations within institutions and how to kind of nurture those along. I thought she was a bit of a, kind of a genius in that regard, in thinking about how to be kind of like a bridge figure. We don't seem to have a lot of bridge figures in our national political life today. And there's a lot of bonding that happens with our own tribes, right? But we don't necessarily have a lot of individuals who kind of stand as sort of bridge figures in between, different groups, and maybe we also don't have a lot of institutions that also sort of, kind of nurture that along. So more institutions like that, obviously, would be welcome. But thinking about that, the bonding and bridging capital, the theorist Robert Putnam has written on these topics, that there's the two different kinds of social capital. The bonding is with deep, people with whom you get along, basically your people. But bridging social capital is indispensable too. And really that's what, in a way, it's a 20th and 21st century social science way of putting what these guys were trying to get at, bridging social capital between groups that disagree with each other. And just even talking about it and putting it out there, I think, is step one, I think. And that there was so much historical evidence for their focus on this too is, I think, worth putting out there.
You mentioned earlier in your talk that they had privatized meetings that were really secret, in which they could alleviate some of their disagreements. Do you believe that in current day Congress, more closed meetings would alleviate some of this discourse?
That's a good question, and I'm not a scholar of Congress today, so I might defer to people who know more about the inner workings of Congress on that point. I think, though, there is evidence that when you're out of the limelight and can kind of sit down and not have to posture, that you can actually maybe get a little bit more work done than if you're you've got at least one eye on how you're being perceived by C-SPAN or by social media. Just so long as, I think sunlight, of course, also is an important, value in our politics too. So there's maybe a balance to be struck, but I think we have a lot of sunlight, but we don't have a lot of sort of compromise happening. And maybe finding some ways to sort of have, I think a number of years ago, this is not on the point of secrecy so much, but about hanging out together. After Gabby Giffords was shot in that terrible shooting in Arizona, I think it was in 2010 or 11, at the State of the Union address, Republicans and Democrats sat next to each other, not on opposite sides of the hall, but together. And there was a different spirit that you could at least sense there in the room. Just one illustration of that. But whether they could actually spend more time just talking with each other offline, I think there could be value to that. Certainly in legal deliberations, which I know more about, there is obvious benefit to, at some point, getting out of the public eye and hashing out arguments just on the basis of arguments themselves. But it's worth thinking more about too.
You may have already kind of touched on this earlier with the discussion about Sandra Day O'Connor, but President Washington presided over the convention. He was influential in getting Hamilton and Madison to write the Federalist Papers, and he really strongly pushed consideration, deference, and those things. Sorry, I forgot my third point. But today we don't really have anybody of that stature, not just in the sense that Justice O'Connor was hosting meetings in our house, but George Washington was such a colossal figure of the time. Everybody respected him. To what extent do we need a figure like that to get the sort of spirit? To what extent is he essential to the spirit of amity?
I do think this story does show that individuals matter at kind of critical moments, and George Washington's sort of style was indispensable. He was, he said that these virtues were indispensable, but everybody on the ground called him indispensable at the time. And I don't think they were just sort of making that up. He did sort of tower over the political kind of the political moment at that time, and so people did sort of defer to him in that regard. And he was, he's not an intellectual. He was not, a James Madison figure, but he was behind the scenes. He was urging the publication of the Federalist Papers. In fact, he was actually going ahead and distributing them to other people in the state of Virginia, saying, "Look at this. This can be helpful." Yeah, so absolutely. I mean, I think Washington's example or other people's examples, Abraham Lincoln, I obviously think of him as well, underlines this point that these collection of virtues or kind of qualities or mores, hopefully they're kind of generated, at the grassroots level, and maybe there's more to be thought about how to make that happen. But no question about it, this was something that Washington sort of put his imprint on, and Madison responded in kind, and Hamilton responded in kind, and so then also did the Anti-Federalists. And so he by dint of his position, groups on both sides saw the virtue or the wisdom of it. And I think your point also implies that maybe we don't really have that kind of figure today. And I think I might be in agreement with you on that. And we could use more of those figures for sure.
Well, please join me once again in thanking our guest, Professor Derek Webb.
Thanks.